We're going to start this morning's session with Francesco, who is the French National Centre for Scientific Research Director of Research and Professor at the University of Bergen. And he's going to talk to us today about Neandertals and the end of the one-fossil-species-one-cognition axiom.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming in spite for some of us of a long dinner yesterday night. And I would like to thank also the organizer. What I like in Gibraltar is that you always feel to be surrounded by friends, which is very nice. And sometimes they stop when you finish your talk and the first two questions arrive, of course. But this is how science works. And also thank you for the wonderful organization. This is demonstrated, among others, by the fact that today I have, in order to indicate something on the slide, one ruler provided by Christopher, two sticks, one gray and one black, plus the umbrella that you already saw yesterday. So, I mean, I have no excuse if I don't show you what I want to show. Okay, so, it has been assumed for very long, although not always explicitly, that evolution set the neural substrate, and that the neural substrate fix the cognitive abilities of a species, and this determine the behavioral repertoire and cultural practices of that species, and this we are talking about human. But if it was so simple, this would entail for our species, as with other, a process of isolation, production of random mutation, selection of successful variant, speciation, and a novel cognition. This was the view favored 20 years ago when some people, Richard Klein, others, were thinking that all elements suggesting, that the emergence of modern human were due to a genetic mutation occurring 50,000 years ago. And this idea was challenged later on by a string of discoveries in Africa. I was involved in some of them. Personal ornament occurring now in Morocco more than 100,000 years ago, engraving from Blombos, the newly published few days ago, drawing from Blombos, bone tools quite similar to those that we found in the Upper Paleolithic, mastic, etc. But in fact, the interpretation that dominate the interpretation of these new discovery were not very different from the one proposed for the revolution model. In fact, that all that would have spread by a single speciation event, a group of small group of modern human originated in Southern or East Africa, and quickly replacing all archaic humans living in Africa. But there was a problem with that. For example, we know now, we published a paper in Science a few months ago in showing that there is a consistent use of pigment in Africa before the alleged speciation. And in some cases, many of these innovations do not occur in very large area of Africa until recently. And some of them, like, for the beads made of marine shell or the bone tool, they disappear sometimes for dozens and thousands of years, and they reappear later. So we don't see this exponential growth or explosion that would be associated with a single speciation event and this new cognition, new incredible cognition that would have been provided by evolution to these new species. And we have tried to make sense of that recently at the conference in Oxford, and published this paper in Trends in Ecology and Evolution, in which we say, well, there are now consistent evidence that, in fact, things were not so simple, that we may envision the possibility that many different populations contributed to the emergence of modern humans in Africa. And I put this slide with the photo as a special gift to Milford, because, in fact, you see here among the people Chris Stringer, is a quote of the, and they say, when I saw that, I said, well, perhaps we should dedicate this conference to Milford, because after what Svante said, and his authorship of this, the cover is a multi-regional origin for modern human in Africa, we said, well, this is what Milford was saying 30 years ago, and only part of the scientific community was agreeing with him. So I think it's really, let's say, quite interesting to see that things can change in time. Well, and so, I mean, we also had other reasons for thinking that in fact, that this does not work. In fact, the very concept of a fossil species as synonymous of a biological species has been put more and more into question. And we have, we know that we have clear evidence that modern human interbreed with Neanderthal, Neanderthal interbreed with Denisovan with modern humans. So, I mean, each new generation of genetic data seem to blur the concept of fossil species than when the paleoanthropologists had when interpreting morphological differences between fossils in the past. And on the archaeological side, because here I'm an archaeologist and not a paleoanthropologist, we see some of this innovation occurring in the archaeological record well before the alleged speciation. I give as example this freshwater mussel that we published in Nature a couple of years ago with Dutch colleagues from Trinil. This is the new dating of the size show that this is 540,000 years old. But it is worth recalling that this is not, this engraving is not isolated. We also show that these Homo erectus, in fact, were only collecting the big shell, and they were collected in different environments, you know, in river, in lake, and this is indicated by the width-length ratio of the shell. And they also invented a very clever way to open them without cracking them, because if you punch them, and we found the hole in the right place where the adductor muscle is, in fact, the shell opened without, without any problem. So it's, let's say, the engraving occur in a context in which we see that they have, they know what to do with this fresh muscle. We are publishing now from the side Shushan, Linjing, possible engravings with ochre in China, and this is a site with human remains. We have published a paper which shows with they use bones as retoucher. These are the first bone retoucher known from China. So it's possible that at that other site in Eurasia, we start seeing these new behavior. And many of these innovations, it was already presented in previous talk and in talk that will come after ours, we see that the Neanderthal produced some of these incredible innovation. Not only in some cases they produce lithic technology and stone tool that they were with a technique that were more refined of those used by contemporary modern human, or perhaps just say humans in Africa, but they were also using mastics, of course, with not the same type of mastic that we see at the same time in Africa, that was mostly made by yellow wood, but modifying and heating birch bark. They also use pigment. The publication of the pigment after 60 years after the excavation of the Terra Mata show that there is a clear use of red ochre at the site at least 300,000 years ago. There are also indication from Maastricht Belvedere, and we published recently a paper on the manganese oxide from a number of sites in France that we try to find with chemical analysis the sources, and they show a quite complex knowledge of the geological environment. And we know that Neanderthal put pigment on fossil shells that were collected in the case of Fumane, 90 kilometers from the site at Quevanton. They colored just one side of a pecten, the other side was naturally red. So they make a mixture of hematite and goethite to make red the other side. We have a lot of pigment from a number of, we have, a database, we created a database, and there are 33 Mysterian sites with pigment and 75 different contexts. You have the evidence from Bruniquel in a deep cave in the Pyrenees in which Neanderthal went and broke 4 tons of stalagmite. I hope for them they've not done that just in one day, but they clearly create this circular structure for which there is we are in trouble to propose any functional interpretation. And just mention, because I know that David is talking about that later, the use of talon by Neanderthal, the collection of feather. We have many objects with incision in the Mysterian. I've recently published an analysis of this hyena, fragment of an hyena femur from Le Pradel site in a paper on from number sense to number symbol, a special issue of the Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society on counting in animal and human. And I've not put here a raven bone from Zaskalnaya that we published in PLOS ONE with analysis of the notches on it. And we published recently a cortex engraved from a Crimean site. Don't want to go into detail, but Neanderthal, as you know, engaged very early in primary burial, and we even can wonder whether, in fact, the oldest burial is Neanderthal, primary burial Neanderthal, and not made by modern humans. And everybody knows here the Gorham's Cave, but perhaps it's worth remembering that when we did the experiment that Clive showed in this photo, in which he was not really busy, but I was, that the experimental reproduction of these engravings showed that between 180 and 320 stroke was necessary to produce such a deep pattern on the dolomite at the back of the Gorham's Cave. And now, this has been already mentioned, the possibility that the Neanderthal produce rock art, including enhanced stencil, in 3 caves from Iberia, which is, if it's confirmed by future study, including in some site in France, in which we know that probably this is also the case, we'll have accepted the idea that, in fact, Neanderthal were the first to go into deep caves and produce rock art. So we are a lot of different innovation, but what I would like to do here is to spend a part of my talk on innovation from a key site called the Grotte du Renne. You may know this site. It has been a site that has been the subject of a debate for, I would say, 20 years. And I will present the unpublished data of a monograph that we are publishing on this site, in which there will be the full list of all the human remains, which is not my job. But I'm involved in this monograph for the study of the personal ornament, the bone tools, and also we are reducing a Bayesian analysis of all the radiocarbon ages produced so far, putting together all radiocarbon ages and those produced by Tomagam and Jean-Jacques Hublin, etc. So I will present here unpublished data because I think they are relevant. And let's consider that as the sort of, I will try to, I hope that will be the straw that will break the camel's back of these fossil species unique cognition axiom. So the Grotte du Renne, well, is a key site because it's one of the sites in which we see a very advanced cultural behavior, a very complex material culture with personal ornament, bone tools, that part of they've been already published by us a number of years ago, a lot of black and red pigment associated with human remains that have been identified, described as Neanderthal, or at least with a lot of Neanderthal character. And these personal ornaments have been cited and sometimes presented in a number of publications, but in fact, there was no comprehensive analysis of all this personal ornament. This is what I'm going to present here today. Just to recall for those of you who are not, been involved in all this debate, and this is, of course, is not a comprehensive list, but to remember that after the publication done in the 60s by André Leroy-Gourhan, who proposed that from the human remains, these were Paleanthropian, which was a way to call the Neanderthal, which was not, was controversial and not really accepted. But since he was professor at Collège de France, you cannot question somebody who's professor at Collège de France. So it basically remained a bit unchallenged. But this debate started in a paper that Clive mentioned yesterday during his talk, with a paper by Jean-Jacques Hublin, who proposed that these people were Neanderthal based on the semicircular canal of the scan of the canal that was more similar to the Neanderthal baby than to modern human baby. But in the same paper, he was also saying this demonstrated that the Neanderthal were acculturated by modern humans, so they could not have done these things by themselves. Okay, so this was his argument. But in fact, his argument was not based on the result of his own work. And so this attracted some reaction, a paper in Current Anthropology, another that I did with Joao in Journal World Prehistory, in which re-questioned the chronology of the transition. And among others, we were saying, well, there are clear evidence, even just from what we know, that these people produce their object by themselves, because they are left over byproduct of this object in the shuttle peroneal layer. And after that was, I'm not mentioning all the papers, but the paper by Sarah Bailey and Jean-Jacques, in which they say the dental remains are really Neanderthal. A paper by Barry Youssef and Jean-Guillaume Borde, in which they propose that the teeth, the Neanderthal teeth, in fact, come from the Mousterian layer. So the shuttle peroneal would have been made by moderns, but in fact it would be the reworking, pushing the human remains in the shuttle peroneal layer. A paper by Tom Higham, who did a lot of dates, radiocarbon dates, and based on his analysis proposed that in fact the site was totally reworked and not trustable. And a paper by us in which, working on the archaeological material, we say, well, we don't see that if you plot and we consider the stratigraphic distribution of the remains. And a new paper by Jean-Jacques Hublin, who did new radiocarbon ages on his side, and his interpretation was that, in fact, Tom Higham and his team has only chosen with bones with very low collagen content, and that, in fact, their radiocarbon determination and all the outsider that they found was due to the fact that there was a lot of contamination. I don't think that is the reason. And after then, an answer by Tom Higham say, no, we did everything well, and you did the things badly. Okay, but in fact, in the new chapter in the book, we show that in fact the reason for this discrepancy is the fact that Tom Higham used a sublayer instead of the layer identified by Leroy-Gourhan. And with Bayesian modeling, if you multiply the number of layers, you also multiply the number of outsiders. But if you take the radiocarbon ages made by Higham and made by Hublin, in fact, they are almost identical. The real difference, in fact, is in the dating of the Aurignacian, but the shuttle peroneal come out to be absolutely identical. So it's just a matter of creating sublayer. It's a problem with the Bayesian modeling. And then another paper, last paper, in which with the zoom technique, this author, including Jean-Jacques, show that many undetermined bones should be rather, considered as Neanderthal. So there was a number of hypotheses put forward to understand why we have all this personal ornament in the shuttle peroneal layer. So you already understood that one of these hypotheses was the reworking of the layer, so that these personal ornament could not be associated with Neanderthal. They are clearly coming from the Aurignacian level, and they were originally made by modern Aurignacian. The acculturation of Neanderthals So the Neanderthal would have collected personal ornament at an orignation site, or perhaps they were imitating without really understanding. This was the Paul Mella's idea, or there was the result of a long-distance influence of contact between Neanderthal and modern humans. Independent invention, this is what we propose in current anthropology, or a cultural exchange, but a cultural exchange in which people, in fact, were perfectly understanding what the other was doing, and in fact was influenced by them, and also influenced them, the other people back. But these have not been really considered, but the acculturation of anatomically modern human by Neanderthal, and this is a possibility that the Neanderthals start making these personal ornament, and they were copied by modern humans. And perhaps the fact that, in fact, this hypothesis has come out in a number of previous presentations that, in fact, the biological affiliation of these people does not matter anymore because we knew that they have exchanged gene already, etc. And the hypothesis that apparently is contradicted by the proteomic techniques that these people were modern humans. But, in that case, why there are all these teeth that have Neanderthal character, and all the undetermined little pieces of bone are considered and identified as Neanderthal. And now we know much better chronologically where the shuttle-peronian is. Also thanks to the many radiocarbon ages done in the past by Oxford, the lab, and other. So the shuttle-peronian seems to be present between 45,000 and 42,500 years ago, and spread over an area that go from the Basque Country up to the northeast of, 200 kilometers from east of the Paris Basin. Although this point, in fact, is just the Grotte du Renne. It's not. There are many other shuttle-peronian sites up there. So the site was excavated by André Leroi-Gourhan after the Second World War in 1963, and although a lot have been written on problem with excavation technique, Leroi-Gourhan, he was a young archaeologist, but it was certainly an excavation done much better than other excavation in France at the time. So there was an stratigraphic digging, there was a very large area exposure of the occupation surface. He plot all the key finds, as we will see with the personal ornament, and also he was systematically sieving all the sediment, which resulted in the recovery of many tiny little objects. And perhaps it's important to recall here that there are, at the Grotte du Renne, there are a number of Mousterian layers, 3 shuttle-peronian layers, which are the 10, 9, and 8, an orignation layer, and after we have a gravation and the Magdalenian layer. So the shuttle-peronian are the 10, the 9, and the 8, but the 8 is a site which is a layer which is quite sterile with the presence of carnivore and relatively little material, and already in the paper in Current Anthropology, we propose that the 8 is a problematic layer in which may have some mixture between the orignation and the shuttle-peronian. So we study, this is our job as archaeologists, all this personal ornament. We try to sometimes decipher the context. This is, of course, when you are working on a collection of objects that have been excavated 50 years ago, sometimes there are ink, as we will see, ink writing covered with a varnish. The varnish has flake off. Sometimes you have only half of the. So for some objects, it's problematic to know the stratigraphic provenance, and I will show you which are these objects. The first big difference that you see is that, in fact, between the gravation, you see there are a lot of shell in the gravation and a lot of teeth in the shuttle-peronian. And also the first difference that you see is that, in fact, there are much more personal ornament in the shuttle-peronian, overall 52 personal ornament, and only 11 personal ornament in the orignation, and 24 in the gravation, and no personal ornament in the Mousterian. So these are all the gravation personal ornament. From the gravation, you only have fossil shell. fossil shells that we know from a number of species, they come from the Paris Basin. From the lutation, they come from, you know, an outcrop, fossil outcrop. There are 200 kilometers west of the site. And these are the personal ornaments from the Orignacia. In fact, are very few. There are some ivory pendant or broken ivory pendant, little pieces of stalagmite. In fact, we don't know whether these have been used as personal ornament, but there are no stalagmite formation in the cave. So somebody apparently has taken these fragments of personal ornament, which are naturally perforated, and taken to the site. But, you know, we don't know they've been used as personal ornament. We have also a wolf incisor with a tiny, tiny perforation, and a shell, an Ampullina parisensis, which is very similar to this Ampullina parisensis, which are also not perforated, found in the gravation layer. So there is likely that this shell, in fact, come from or were originally left in the gravation layer. And these are the personal ornaments from the shuttle peronian, from the layer 9 and 10 of the shuttle peronian. So the more abundant are the white-tailed eagle talon that you see here, which is, well, may indicate a continuity with the use of this talon in the Mousterian. But we also have the Eurasian eagle hole in a talon. Some probably Arctic fox canine, bovid incisor, probably bison, tube made of bird long bone, some of them decorated with notches. We also have reindeer phalanges, either perforated or notched, and a reindeer incisor, and reindeer accessory metapodial that you see here. Some fossil crinoid that I don't know whether were used as personal ornament, but were taken to the site. They look like little beads. And we also have a beaver incisor. And a wolf canine, a bear incisor, and this object, which is quite fun, in fact, it is a fragment of the root of a woolly rhinos that have been detached from the, you know, from the tooth and grooved. And a rinconella is a fossil bivalve. And these are the objects coming from layer 8 that I told you is a bit problematic. And in layer 8, we have fragment of ivory pendant, which are not identical, but it could be, you know, similar to those found in the Orignacian. And we have a bear canine, which is not perforated and may be used perhaps as a retoucher, so perhaps it's not a personal ornament. Some fragment of bone tube made of long bird bones, a hyena incisor, a horse incisor, and another fox canine. Okay, and these are ornaments with no clear stratigraphic distribution because it is flaked off. So this is a shell, is fossil shell, two fox canine, and a very large red deer canine with an incredibly large perforation is a very old male looking at the wear, okay, in which we have a V or an X, so we don't know whether it could be a gravation or shuttle peronian, but probably gravation when we see how these things were attached. So in the shuttle peronian, interestingly, they use a number of techniques to produce the personal ornament. They scrape the root and after make a hole. So this is the main technique. And in one case, we have a case in which they make a first perforation and after it's break off and they make a second perforation. In some of the objects, they also abrade the surface of the object, making little facets. And interestingly, they they make grooves around the roots in different way, and this is a technique that we only find in the shuttle peronian. There is no one object like that in the orignation or the gravation. So sometimes it are just few notches that do not, do not create a continuous groove, and in some cases they shaped the object in order to make a little head with a quite well made restriction, as you can see here, for example, with the reindeer accessory metapodial. Okay, so now I will say something about the spatial distribution because of the excavation started in the late 40s. In fact, at the time, the square was not really squared, and so we have replaced the square that was not square on a grid, but of course they required quite a lot of work. And it is interesting to know that to see that most of the shuttle peronian personal ornament come from the center of the cave. And that this is the area in which Leroy-Gourhan proposed that there was structure and with a very large fireplace. And the little circles that you have here are the grindstone used to process ochre around the fireplace. So most of the personal ornament come from this area at the center of the excavation. And also is interesting that in some cases we find objects of the same type very close together. For example, the talon of the eagle that our zooarchaeologist Cécile Moret-Cheviret thinks they come from the same foot. In fact, some of them are found very close together. The same, for example, for two reindeer incisor, or for some reindeer phalanges. So this seems to show that in some cases, in fact, there was, when the object was lost, the object did not move that much in terms of their spatial distribution. While, if you look at the distribution of the gravation, for example, the gravation of personal ornament are only found close to the cave wall. And in the case of the orignation, also they are not found in the center, but in two clusters. In the shuttle peronian, in the layer 8, apparently, sorry, to some degree follow more the orignation distribution, and there is only one reindeer incisor found in the middle of the cave. So basically, there are a lot of reasons for thinking that these personal ornaments were made by the orignation and do not come from the, were made by the shuttle peronian, these people with Neanderthal character, and do not come from the orignation. In fact, there are 5 times more ornament in the shuttle peronian than the orignation. These personal ornaments are very different from the orignation, in fact. And of course, the hypothesis of a mixture entailed the fact that these objects should be the same. And then, in fact, if there was a percolation, you would find less object in the shuttle peronian than in the orignation. So 74% of the shuttle peronian bead come from the lowermost layer 10. So in fact, if it was coming from the orignation, they would have crossed 2 layers to arrive to the lowermost shuttle peronian layer. And there are differences. The differences are not just in the raw material, in the bead type, in the number of types, in the technology, and there is also difference in the spatial distribution of this object. However, we also found out that some object in the layer 8 could be orignation, particularly this fragment of ivory pendant. This is consistent with our study of the bone tools. I'm not going into detail in the study of the bone tool, but just to tell you something that is, support this idea. For example, 40% of the bone tools in the orignation level are made with reindeer antler. and the reindeer antler is not used in the Chateaubriand. We have a single little piece of antler with a notch here coming from the layer 8. But in the Chateaubriand layer, they only use bones and ivory. There is no reindeer antler used. And of course, as with the personal ornament, there are much more bone tool in the lowermost Chateaubriand layer than in the other Chateaubriand layer and in the origination. Here you see the one categories, which those made with ivory. So we have worked quite in detail the technology, and I'm not going to explain that in detail, but what the Chateaubriand seems to do is to produce a spear point of different size. And they use two different techniques. For the big spear point, which are quite big, because in fact they are 16 millimeters, here you see differences in the dimension of the section, because are almost all broken. So they produce preform which are very similar in size to the finished object. While for the smaller spear point, they use probably the leftover from the production of this big object that they scrape and they take it to this size. What they are interested in is producing spear point with a perfectly circular section. As you see that, in fact, they plot in the middle. So they really want to do something which is perfectly circular. And we also have in the Chateaubriand layer a lot of these sort of smoother, than in French we call the lissoir, some of which have been found in the Mysterian of Achillean tradition and published a few years ago by Marie Soressi and colleagues, so which are ribs and sometimes a fragment of long bone, which are worn at the tip. Some of them are decorated with notches and also have ochre stuck into the spongy bone. So this is also an element of continuity with previous Mysterian bone tool. And there are also clear differences consistent with what I said about the personal ornament in the ochre use. There are, the Neanderthal use a lot of red pigment and black pigment. In the lowermost Chateaubriand, we have 15 kilos of pigment and less than half a kilo in the origination. So if this pigment was processed and taken to the site, we should, by the origination, we should explain how 15 kilos of pigment cross these two layers and land in the lowermost Chateaubriand layer. In fact, there is much more pigment in the Chateaubriand layer than in the origination layer. And in a paper we published 3 years ago, we examine pigment from other Chateaubriand sites. And in fact, it came out that the use of the red pigment and black pigment at Chateaubriand site is quite common. And so there is no, in this sense, the Gros-Durand Chateaubriand is not an idiosyncratic example. So the Chateaubriand use red and black pigment. So we come back to the hypothesis. I think we can reject the hypothesis of reworking of the layer. And if we consider the hypothesis of an acculturation of Neanderthal by modern humans or a collection, etc., the idea of a collection, of an imitation, etc., could entail the fact that you would have a sort of impoverished version of the Aurignacian personal ornament. But we compare the Chateaubriand personal ornament at Gros-Durand with those from the Aurignacian. So we compare here the number of personal ornaments, so the type of personal ornament with the number of raw material used. In fact, it came out that the Chateaubriand personal ornament from the Gros-Durand, in fact, have a very high diversity. So if they are different in terms of raw material use and the type use, so it's not at all an impoverished version of what we find in the Aurignacian. So the hypothesis that for me still stand are independent invention or cultural exchange, perhaps an acculturation of modern human by Neanderthal, or perhaps the fact that in fact the biological affiliation does not matter anymore. This population were Chateaubriand with a lot of Neanderthal character. Perhaps they already had also modern human character, but then they were producing a very complex material culture. So now I come back to the general issue. So the general issue is we should not accept anymore this axiom of one cognition for one fossil species. In a paper that we just published, we create a large database with 600 references in the SC, in case you want to download it, of a number of cultural innovation related with symbolic behavior, technology, subsistence in the last 800,000 years. And what we see, we look at those, we say that the cultural innovation emerged at different times in different parts of the world, among different populations, and some of them were lost and reacquired later on in different form. So a number of these innovations were present outside Africa before the human dispersal. And the timing, location, and pace of innovation appear inconsistent with scenario attributing the spread of modern cultural trait to concomitant, classic, or restrictive, we can say, biological Darwinian evolution process, such as the heritable genetic mutation or speciation event. So what we should think is that, in fact, the cultural innovation were triggered by several interconnected factors, dynamic factor, environmental and social factor, and they are the outcome of complex and nonlinear population dynamics and cultural trajectory. They need to be understood and traced at the regional scale and not just at the scale of new species producing things new because a result of a single speciation event. So this is to show you that, in fact, all this data seems to support the idea that we have to abandon this axiom. And perhaps in two provocative papers, one of which has come out yesterday in biological theory with a philosopher who is also a brain scientist, we propose a different model, and we wonder whether we really need the biological evolution. So we basically propose that with 3 ingredients, you can get rid of this one cognition, one fossil species axiom. One is what we call the cultural exaptation, which is, we borrow the term exaptation from Stephen Jay Gould and Elizabeth Verba. And we say that this cultural exaptation refers to the co-option of existing cultural feature for new purposes. Cultural exaptation does not require a concomitant biological exaptation or heritable genetic changes as a prerequisite, but occur at the truly cultural level. Basically, we are building on the shoulder of giants, so we have some innovation, and we create a new innovation with new purposes on something that already exists. And the other is what we call the cultural neural reuse. Basically, the plasticity of the brain is referred to cases in which exposure to cultural practices induces the formation, activation, and stabilization of new functional and/or structural brain networks during the individual lifespan. But there is a missing ingredient in this recipe, that is a different mode of cultural transmission. The history of human is made of cases in which geniuses has invented incredible stuff, but this was not accepted by surrounding people, either because the group were too small or because, in fact, the people did not invest enough time to create the mode of cultural transmission that would allow this innovation to get fixed and transmitted to new generation. So I think that as archaeologists, we should try to better infer mode of cultural transmission from material culture. I made that try a couple of years ago in a paper in which we, with William Banks, we try to tackle different mode of cultural transmission in the spatial dimension, temporal dimension, social dimension. So I won't go into detail in this, but I mean, is a try to try and see how different mode of cultural transmission may be associated, in fact, then change through time. So you do not just use one. I mean, even in primates, you see that there are 2 different or 3 different ways, and some of them are abandoned and some other are retaken, and we have to try to see how their association would change in time and allow this innovation to get fixed. I just give an example, finishing the talk, of one possible exaptation. I think that, in fact, what I'm saying is quite similar to what Clive was saying yesterday. For example, the use of ochre. He mentioned the fact that, people were, perhaps borrowing from raptor this use. But another possible exaptation is the use of ochre as to protect the skin from the ultraviolet radiation. And if this happened in a population living, for example, in Southern Africa, when you move toward the equator, this would, in fact, protect you by the selective pressure of the higher ultraviolet radiation. So there will be an exaptation with no symbolic implication, and that then in a further exaptation is when, in fact, this is used to create boundaries, to identify your social group, your social status, your ethnic group, and so on. And perhaps a further exaptation that we find archaeologically in the personal ornament in Southern Africa and Northern Africa is when this pigment is put on beads, change the morphology of bead, allow you to create a more complex syntax using personal ornament. And in this case, of course, the original role, which was just the protecting you from the sun, is totally lost. And that was all. Thank you very much.